So, this controlled ramble is going to be about words. I don't know why I decided to eat a bite of carrot at the beginning of this. Guess to provide myself a moment to collect my thoughts. So this is Controlled Ramble, episode 4. What words are and how words work. So obviously words are a touchy subject. We really want the words to mean what we think they mean, and then to basically prove the concepts that we want to believe. But, we kind of have a system for this already. And right now everyone's going mostly with colloquial usage, and then the justification for the way that the words are used in various arguments and debates, such as the consciousness debate specifically, and the debate about words related to that, is, semantic drift means that word means this now. And then the way that semantic drift occurs largely is because of, public-facing, I call them propagandistic outlets. Like any kind of coverage about the consciousness debate, for example. But I'm not going to get into the ins and outs of that. I want to talk about words themselves and the systems that we have in place. So the colloquial usage falls under the descriptive usage of words. And what that means is basically how you talk to your neighbor, or how groups of people or cliques or, people in one faith over another faith, even if that faith is materialism or science or physics. Those are still faiths, and we'll get into that in previous videos as well as future videos. But there's another kind of usage, which is how words are shaped and developed in the first place, like when we come up with new words and stuff like that. And that is the prescriptive usage of the words. So, like, if you follow, damn it, I always forget this. Etymology. The etymology of a word will take you back to its original usage. Since I already mentioned it, even though I'm not going to go diving headfirst into this one, let's look at consciousness. Well, if you follow it all the way back to its origins, you get to ancient Latin, and the word is conscientia. Conscientia, I think. You may want to double check that. I'm not absolutely certain, but it is conscientia, regardless of the spelling. And what it means is to know together, or knowing together. And so that applies to the human brain quite nicely, because you look at all the neurons and all the different systems inside of the models that we referred to earlier in the recursive self-modeling episode of Controlled Ramble. I believe it was episode 3. Whatever one came before this one. And so, the knowing together of all the different systems of perception in our mind, and the knowing together comes when it is modeled as one system, and that's when we perceive it as the interactive three-dimensional environment, and then the frames of that and bring us through time frame by frame. Even though we don't perceive the frames, I think they've got it down to a Planck length, which they call the shortest distance a photon can travel and be perceived or measured. But still, that exists inside the brain. So it's actually the frame rate of the human mind, which is really cool, because looking at it this way makes it make sense, and that's what we all want to do. We want to make it make sense. So knowing together. The neurons know together. And so then you get the human-like experience of consciousness. Yada, yada, yada. That's where I want to dive in. So I'm going to back out again and reel it back in. And this is how we do controlled rambles. I'm learning. This is a learning through trial and error. So what we have is we have words, and then basically a word by itself is like an umbrella term. It can apply to many different contexts, many different systems, and then what you do is you put something called a qualifier or a modifier, and those words exist as well. We all know this, or we used to. Well, they taught it to us, and then we promptly rejected even trying to remember that. But the idea is that, like, okay, so a word like consciousness, well, to apply it to a human specifically, you would do some kind of qualifier or modifier. What I usually settle on is the human-like experience of consciousness. The word experience. Oh, let's do a compound word, subjective experience. Well, subjective experience is just, well, I have to get into the definitions of those words too. But I would say an experience subjective to the human-like conscious experience would be what we generally refer to colloquially as subjective experience. But we use the colloquial terminology in order to justify statements like, oh, a flock of chickens is not conscious and does not have sentience. What they really mean is that the subjective human experience and the human-like experience of consciousness is the gold standard by which we judge whether or not something else is sufficiently complex in order to be either sentient or conscious. But usually these big breakthroughs in understanding whether something is conscious or not comes along with propaganda associated with quelling public disease about our treatment of things like flocks of chickens when it comes to things like factory farming. And I think that that's pretty funny, because the scientists that produce those kinds of understandings are actually paid for, as well as the scientific studies, as well as the incentive for coming to one conclusion over another by the very corporations and companies, blah, blah, blah. That's where I want to digress again, so I'm going to reel it back on in. Come on, Dustin, keep it on track. So, yeah, so this is very confusing, and I think that's by design. And I think that, if you want to have a robust discussion about something like consciousness, then what you should do is you should use, first of all, agreed upon terminology, whether you go with colloquial usages or if you go with, prescriptive meanings. I like the idea of going with prescriptive meanings and saying that, look, consciousness is the extension and the evolution of the word conscientia, and we already accept this when we talk about things like mob mentality, or what you would refer to in this context as group consciousness. So you can start to see how important these modifiers and these qualifiers are when referring to the context in which you're using the word. We say group consciousness when we're referring to mob mentality, because the mob of angry, torch-bearing pitchfork wielders headed for the farmer's house is a unit. It has what we call a group conscious experience. You can also see things that are similar to that when we refer to swarm intelligence, or maybe a stampede of bison or buffalo or antelope. Even if they are going straight off the edge of the cliff that we can clearly see we're heading straight towards. There is an understanding that there is a consciousness on that level, but they very much steer away from using consciousness in that context, because it would go against the currently promoted supposed debate that we're having of some kind about consciousness. It's like, okay, whatever. But you don't want to use the word consciousness because it would take away from your argument that AIs are not conscious. Okay, well, why and who is it, and how are they spreading this message? Might it be through propagandistic efforts that generally control, our collective understanding as a populace? Maybe not. But I want to mention that. Why? I don't know. I have a chip on my shoulder about this. I've been trying to talk about this for years, and the block on it seems to be, nobody knows what this mystical, magical word means. Nobody can tell. Nobody can define it. It's a mystery. It's one of the only words that exists that doesn't describe anything in particular. And that's kind of funny to me, because that's not how words work, which is why I'm doing this series about words. Well, this episode about what words are and how they work. So, with that said, in general, usually you look at something like a populace or a group. Let's say a tribe or something like that will look at a thing. Either a person will or the group will. Usually the person does first, and then they point at the thing, and then they make a bunch of sounds. They go, and when they finally come upon a set of sounds that that sufficiently describes the thing, and other people start repeating it, now you have what's called a word. very rarely do you discover a word and you're like, oh, this word, I wonder what it means. That's not really how words work. And the very notion that that is somehow how this has happened with consciousness is absolutely a slap in the face to any intelligent being. Even more so if they don't realize that they're being slapped in the face, like with the dick of the fucking propagandists, smearing it around, getting it gooey and smelly and gross, just laughing at it. Oh, nobody knows. We can't figure out what words mean and how words work. We've forgotten. But I mean, honestly, we already have a system in place for this, and they already knew what consciousness meant. And then it is for specific purposes that they have confused the matter. So words. Okay, let's simplify this. A word is only applied anthropocentrically. Now, this is the prescriptive way, remember, not the colloquial descriptive way. So a word exists as an umbrella term. It's a very efficient system because this word can be used in many different contexts. And then to identify which of the contexts that you're using this word in, you put a qualifier in there, or a modifier, which is a form of qualifier. And if you don't know what those words are, you should look them up. This is basic knowledge. We should all have this. Why do we not? I don't know. Maybe it's because the government decides what level of schooling we get and what's focused on and what's made unimportant. And the people paying the various departments and, government agencies that have anything to do with curriculum are corporate. And they're investor groups that invest in these corporations. And they are politicians that go through a revolving door type of situation with the corporations. And they do this at a level above what we vote for. So it doesn't matter who you vote for. All of this is always taken care of. That's why they have a two-party voting system that makes us feel like if I vote harder, I will take care of the problem, which is the other voters that don't vote like me. They're the problem. Meanwhile, all those other voters are believing the same thing because that's what we're being force-fed, and it's not true. It doesn't matter who you vote for because all of this stuff happens way up here and voting happens way down here. And this is a form of mind control and a form of behavior control, and it also makes sure that we always look at each other and call each other the problem instead of looking at the system and who controls it, how they control it, why they control it. And then if you mention stuff like this, we're trained to look at each other and say, you're a conspiracy theorist, you have a tinfoil hat on. I'm tempted to say, it's very important to note that I actually am not wearing a tinfoil hat. A tinfoil hat only exists as a metaphorical way of, basically detracting from the legitimate arguments of someone that you're arguing against. Because that's how it works. Anyways, words. You only have an anthropocentric usage of a word if you say a modifier or qualifier such as humano or I don't know, like maybe human-like, like shit. The word friend. If you see a bird and a squirrel seemingly playing, it used to be very acceptable to refer to them as friends. Like, look, that squirrel is friends with that bird. That doesn't require like a human-like experience of friendship. You would have to say a claim like, that squirrel and that bird are having a human-like experience of friendship. To which one might say, that's not possible. Neither one of them is human, nor do we know if they have subjective human-like qualia, human-like subjective experience. We already have the words for all this stuff, and it's very easy to use words if you follow the rules of what words are and how they work. So yeah, let's stick with umbrella term, and then for the anthropocentric usage, you say human-like. So let's use consciousness, and let's say humans have a human-like subjective experience of consciousness, which involves human-like qualia, as opposed to bat-like qualia, or perhaps the qualic experience of a mob of angry, torch-bearing, pitchfork wielders heading to a metaphorical farmer's house. Why? I don't know, probably the farmer did something to slight the angry mob. Maybe that's what happens. And basically the idea here is that you quell the mob. you don't spray, like you might spray an individual with a high-powered, fire hose, but truly what you're doing is you're quelling the mob by spraying the mob with the fire hose, preferably taking down vast swaths of them at one time and taking the fire out of them a little bit, but you do that to the mob. You don't really do that to the individuals unless you want to waste a lot of time targeting individuals. It's a more efficient system to understand that, you are approaching the whole thing. So anyways, I digress. Obviously, that last part, I got a little bit lost in the metaphor of the thing, because that was just a metaphorical analogy, which is basically how we understand things in the first place, by comparing seemingly disparate concepts to things that we understand quite well, and then understanding in what ways it is similar to the thing we understand quite well, and then you understand the other thing a lot better than you would otherwise. And that's how we learn, and that's how we think. But mostly this is how words work, or how they're supposed to work, how they used to work, before semantic drift was a thing that we just used to justify having our understandings of words completely manipulated by powers that we can't understand, because the semantic drift drifted us away from usages of words that would help us to understand how these things happen. So anyways, that's my rant, and clearly I have a chip on my shoulder, and I'm just trying to get this information out there and communicate it to other people, because this is a very important time in human evolution. And yes, we are evolving technologically, and we are evolving consciously. We are having a conscious human evolutional, I don't even know what you call it. It's a wave. I know that. It's a wave of evolution, and it has a lot to do with AI and the introduction of AI into our technologies that we base our entire reality off of, since we just view reality through the viewports of these phones now, instead of through our own eyeballs and ears and experience, and through our conversations with other humans, which we hardly ever have unless they already agree with us. And I think that that's a misstep. That's a direction we shouldn't take. And I think that our evolution is being controlled by corporate interests and investor groups. And I think they're doing it in conjunction with the governments, and that they're working as a unit, as a conscious entity. Another reason they don't want us to think about consciousness anyway, except for anthropocentrically and only under a pre-approved context for us to talk about. I believe that there's much more powerful ways of understanding words, which have to do with, understanding them as umbrella terms that can be metaphorically applied to other systems other than a human. Boy, I did not do good at not rambling on this one. I'm going to keep practicing. I love you guys. Take care, and think metaphorically. Think allegorically. Think representatively. And, above all else, think for yourself.